Picture this, a sun-scorched studio backlit in Burbank, California. Stage 14, Warner Brothers Pictures. A Tuesday morning in August of 1952. The temperature inside that cavernous, corrugated metal building had climbed past 94 degrees by 8:15 in the morning. 200 people, grips, gaffers, lighting technicians, extras, assistant directors, studio executives, makeup artists, wardrobe girls, stand absolutely still. Not because they have been told to, because they cannot move. At the center of it all, a man is screaming. His name is Harold Vance. He is 46 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, and has directed 31 Hollywood pictures in the past 14 years. He is standing 12 feet away from the man he is screaming at, his face the color of a brick wall in direct sunlight, his right hand jabbing the air with every syllable. The veins in his neck are visible from 30 feet away. The words coming out of his mouth would peel paint. The man he is screaming at does not move, does not blink, does not say a word. He simply stands there 6 feet and 4 inches of deliberate stillness, and lets it happen. 200 people are watching. The cameras are cold. Nobody on that set moves a muscle. Then John Wayne opens his mouth and says exactly 4 words. And Harold Vance's career in Hollywood is over. This is that story. To understand what happened on Stage 14 that August morning, you have to understand what Hollywood looked like in the summer of 1952. The studio system was cracking at the seams. Television sets had arrived in 11 million American homes. Weekly cinema attendance had fallen from 90 million in 1948 to 61 million by 1952. The major studios, Warner Brothers, Paramount, MGM, RKO, were scrambling, cutting budgets, slashing contracts, burning through directors the way a ranch hand burns through fence wire. In that landscape, Harold Vance was not a small man. He had started at Warner Brothers in 1938 as a second-unit director on adventure serials, working 14-hour days for $65 a week. By 1941, he had his first picture, a tight crime drama called Shadow at Midnight that came in 4 days under schedule and $12,000 under budget. Jack Warner noticed. In Hollywood, coming in under budget is a language every studio chief speaks fluently. By 1945, Vance had his own parking space on the lot. By 1948, he had a production deal worth $180,000 per year. 31 pictures in 14 years. That is a picture every 5.5 months. The man was a machine. His specialty was control. Harold Vance controlled every square inch of every set he walked onto. He timed his shots to the second. He knew the name of every gaffer, every best boy, every dolly grip on his crew. He expected punctuality. He expected preparation. He expected, above all, deference. You were on Harold Vance's set, which meant you operated by Harold Vance's rules, which meant Harold Vance's word was the last word on every subject from camera angles to how an actor parted his hair. He had built that reputation over 14 years and 31 pictures, and he wore it like a second skin. The picture being shot that August was a Western, a cavalry picture called Drums Along the Yucca, set in Arizona Territory in 1873. It was a mid-budget production, $1 per million, with a 12-week shooting schedule and a cast that included 2 contract players from Warner Brothers and 1 very significant outside hire. Harold Vance had not wanted the outside hire. The studio had insisted, because the outside hire was John Wayne. By August of 1952, John Wayne had made 83 films. 83. He had ridden more horses on camera than most working cowboys had ridden in their actual lives. He had made pictures for Republic, for RKO, for United Artists, for Paramount. He had worked with John Ford 6 times by then, Stagecoach, Ford Apache, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, Rio Grande. And those Ford pictures had taught him something that no amount of directing school could teach. The difference between performing a scene and inhabiting one. He was 45 years old, 220 pounds. And he moved through a Western set with the easy authority of a man who understood every technical element from the horse's temperament to the quality of the light at 4 in the afternoon. He had opinions. He had standards. He had a habit, developed over 2 decades in front of a camera, of making small adjustments to blocking and dialogue that served the scene without anyone having to ask him to. Harold Vance interpreted this as insubordination. The trouble had begun quietly, on the first day of principal photography. Wayne had suggested, with no particular urgency, that a particular shot, a wide establishing view of the cavalry column coming over a ridge, would read better if the column angled 20 degrees further east catching the morning light at a more dramatic angle. Vance had listened to this suggestion for approximately 4 seconds before explaining, with the measured calm of a man who was not yet angry, that he was the director of this picture and that the shot would be set up exactly as he had designed it. Wayne had nodded, said nothing. The shot was set up Vance's way. Day 2, Wayne suggested that a piece of dialogue in the 4th scene, a confrontation between his character and a territorial governor, felt false in a specific place, and that a single line change would make the scene land harder. Vance had not listened for 4 seconds this time. He had cut Wayne off in 12 words and turned back to his camera operator. By the end of the first week, Harold Vance had told 3 separate members of his crew, in private conversations that were not as private as he imagined, that John Wayne was the most difficult actor he had ever worked with. That John Wayne thought he knew more about making pictures than the man behind the camera. That John Wayne was going to learn, on this picture, exactly how a professional film set operated. He did not know that those private conversations had made their way back to Wayne. John Wayne knew exactly what Harold Vance thought of him. He showed up every morning at 6:15, 90 minutes before his call time. He knew his lines. He hit his marks. He said nothing he had not been asked to say. But here's where it changes. There is a particular kind of stillness that very large men can project when they choose to. It is not passivity. It is not vacancy. It is the stillness of a man who is paying attention to everything and reacting to nothing. Yet, John Wayne had that stillness in abundance, and on stage 14 on that August morning, he was wearing it like a coat. He had arrived at 6:12. He had gone to wardrobe. He had gone to makeup. He had walked to the set, a constructed interior of a cavalry post commander's office, 3 walls of aged pine board and a single window with afternoon light blazing through it. And he had stood in the corner nearest the door, in his cavalry captain's uniform, holding a cup of coffee in both hands, and he had watched. He watched the lighting crew adjust the key light 18 inches to the left, then 12 inches back to the right. He watched the camera operator check the gate. He watched Harold Vance move through the space like a man who owned every board and nail in it, touching things, adjusting things, speaking to his assistant director in a low, rapid voice. The hands, if you were watching carefully, told you something. John Wayne's hands were the size of small shovels. The cup of coffee looked like a thimble between his palms. But what was remarkable about those hands was not their size, it was how still they were. Most men, waiting in a corner of a busy film set for 2 hours, fidget. They check their watch. They shift their weight. They find reasons to move. Wayne didn't move. He stood in that corner for 1 hour and 53 minutes, cup of coffee cooling between his palms, eyes moving slow and steady across everything on that set, and he was reading it. He was reading the energy of the room the way a cavalry officer reads terrain. Looking for the high ground, the low ground, the place where trouble was most likely to come from. At 8:07, Harold Vance called the crew to first positions for scene 22, in which Wayne's character confronts the post commander about a disputed order. Vance had blocked the scene with Wayne standing at the window, back partially to camera, face in 3/4 profile. Wayne looked at the blocking tape on the floor for a moment. Then he looked at the window. Then he looked at where the camera was positioned. Someone on that crew, a camera operator named Bill Teschner, who later told this story in a 1974 interview, noticed the expression on Wayne's face in that moment. Not anger. Not defiance. Recognition. What happened next, nobody expected. Wayne stepped to his first position, then moved 4 feet to the right, off the blocking tape, into the center of the set sight line, where the window light would hit his face directly rather than at the 3/4 angle Vance had designed. It was a small adjustment. 4 feet. Maybe 5. Harold Vance saw it before his camera operator did. The silence lasted approximately 2 seconds. Those 2 seconds had a particular quality that everyone on stage 14 that morning would remember for the rest of their careers. It was the silence of a man deciding how much to spend. Then Harold Vance spent everything. He came across that set in 12 steps, and by the time he arrived he was already shouting. Not at a conversational volume. Not at the elevated volume of a director who is frustrated. He was shouting at a volume that bounced off the corrugated metal ceiling of stage 14 and came back down on 200 people like something physical. He was shouting about professionalism, about the chain of command on a film set, about what it meant to disrespect a director in front of his crew, about the fact that he had 31 pictures to his name and he had never had an actor move off his blocking tape without permission, And if John Wayne thought that his name on the marquee gave him the right to redesign shots that had been storyboarded and approved by the studio, then John Wayne was in for an education. He was 12 feet away. He was close enough that the crew in the front row could see the individual drops of perspiration on his forehead. 200 people. Not one of them moved. A young assistant director named Carl Winslow, 24 years old, 8 weeks into his first studio job, later said that he had counted to himself during the silence between Wayne's adjustment and Vance's explosion. He counted to 14 before Vance opened his mouth. He counted 17 seconds of continuous shouting before Wayne's lips moved. 17 seconds of Harold Vance in full voice on a hot August morning with 200 witnesses. The production designer, a veteran named Arturo Milagros, who had been on set since 1934, had seen directors lose their temper before. He had seen actors storm off sets. He had seen props thrown, cameras kicked, entire productions shut down mid-morning because two people with large reputations had stopped being able to share the same room. He had never seen anything like what he saw next, because John Wayne's expression during those 17 seconds did not change. Not once. Not at the volume. Not at the specific content of what Vance was saying, some of which was personal enough to have drawn a response from any other man on the lot. Wayne's face was what it had been when he was standing in the corner with his coffee for 1 hour and 53 minutes. Still attentive reading. A woman in wardrobe named Dorothy Sells, she had worked in Hollywood costuming since 1941, said later that watching John Wayne stand there during those 17 seconds was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen on a film set. Not because he was defiant, not because he was intimidated, because he looked, she said, like a man waiting for the appropriate moment to do the appropriate thing. Patiently, without any apparent urgency. Carl Winslow, the young assistant director, tried to step forward at the 14-second mark. Another veteran grip named Frank Donahue put a hand on his shoulder and held him still. Winslow looked at Donahue. Donahue shook his head once. Not yet. Harold Vance ran out of breath at the 17-second mark and pulled in air. That was the moment. John Wayne moved the coffee cup from his right hand to his left. He looked at Harold Vance for exactly 3 seconds. And then the room went silent. In the first second, John Wayne said nothing. He simply looked at Harold Vance with an expression that the camera operator Bill Teschner later described as the way a judge looks at a man before sentencing. Not unkind. Not theatrical. Just certain. In the second, he raised his left hand, the one holding the coffee cup, and set it down on the edge of the nearest set piece, a pine desk, with a gentleness that was almost incongruous with the size of the hand doing the placing. In the third second, he spoke. 4 words. You're blocking the light. He didn't move the way other men moved when they said something like that. There was no leaning forward, no emphasis, no edge in the voice. He said it the way a carpenter says the wall is crooked, as a statement of observable, physical, inarguable fact. You're blocking the light. Harold Vance had been 12 feet away during the 17 seconds of his speech. He was still 12 feet away. He had not moved. And in the silence that followed those 4 words, every person on stage 14 did the same thing. They looked past Harold Vance, past his left shoulder, at the window. The window where the light was coming in. Where Harold Vance was standing. Where Harold Vance had been standing for the entire duration of his 17-second speech. Directly between the light source and the blocking tape he had put down for Wayne to stand on. You could hear it. Not a sound, exactly. More like the collective inhalation of 200 people doing the same calculation at the same moment and arriving at the same answer. The blocking Vance had designed put Wayne at the 3/4 profile position, the less powerful, less cinematic angle. The position Wayne had moved to 4 feet to the right was the position where the window light hit his face clean and full and direct. It was not insubordination. It was not ego. It was geometry. John Wayne had not moved off the blocking tape because he thought he knew better than the director. He had moved off the blocking tape because the director was standing in the light. That's not a power play. That's craft. The silence lasted 5 full seconds. Bill Teschner counted them. He told that story in interviews for the next 22 years. 5 seconds in a room with 200 people where you could hear the ambient hum of the lighting rigs and nothing else. Harold Vance did not move during those 5 seconds. He stood exactly where he had been standing, 12 feet from Wayne, with the window at his back. At the 6th second, he turned and looked at the window. At the 7th second, he turned back. At the 8th second, he took 2 steps to his left, out of the light path entirely. He didn't say anything. He walked to his camera operator, spoke 4 words of his own, reset to original position, and went to his director's chair. Wayne picked up his coffee cup. He walked back to the blocking tape. His original blocking tape, the one Vance had laid down, the one that now had the full window light falling squarely on it because the director was no longer standing in the way. And he took his first position. Arturo Milagros, the production designer, said later that the scene they shot that morning was the best footage in the picture. Maybe the best footage he'd ever seen staged in an interior. The light on Wayne's face in that scene, he said, was the kind of light you spend 3 hours with a gaffer trying to manufacture and never quite get right. Because it was real. Because the geometry was right. Because the man who understood the geometry had quietly, without a word of argument, simply moved to the place where it worked. That's what 2 decades of making Westerns gives you. Not attitude. Not authority for its own sake. Understanding. Wayne never performed and never grandstand. Every adjustment he had made on that set, across 2 weeks of shooting, had been functional. He moved the cavalry column east to catch the morning light. He flagged the false line of dialogue because false dialogue kills the audience's belief, and a dead audience is a box office problem. He stepped 4 feet to the right because the director was standing in his light. Not ego. Every single time, craft. Dorothy Sells, the wardrobe woman, said she had worked with actors for 21 years by that August morning, and she had learned to distinguish between an actor who makes adjustments because he wants more screen time and an actor who makes adjustments because he wants the scene to be better. The first kind, she said, you can spot in about 11 seconds. The second kind is rarer than people think. The physical consequence arrived at noon. When the crew broke for lunch, Harold Vance walked to his production office, a converted broom closet off stage 12, and placed a telephone call to the head of production at Warner Brothers. He told the head of production that he needed Wayne removed from the picture, that he could not work under these conditions, that his authority on his own set had been undermined, and he would not continue. The head of production listened to this for approximately 45 seconds. Then he said, "Harold, you were standing in his light." Vance said, "That is not the point." The head of production said, "It is entirely the point." Wayne always chose not to continue past the necessary point. When Vance walked back onto stage 14 that afternoon, Wayne was already in first position for the next scene, lines memorized, ready to shoot. He did not look at Vance with satisfaction. He did not look at him with anything in particular. He was just there, ready to work. 47 minutes of footage shot that afternoon. They were 17 minutes ahead of schedule by wrap. It did not end on stage 14. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, Harold Vance was sitting alone in his production office at 6:15 in the evening. The rest of the crew had gone home. He had a glass of bourbon. He was a bourbon man, had been since his Navy years, and he had the shot list for the following day open on the desk in front of him, and he was not looking at it. He was looking at his hands. There was a knock at the door. Not aggressive. Not tentative. The knock of a man who is confident of his welcome, but not presumptuous about it. He said, "Come in." John Wayne came in. He was still in his street clothes, a plain cotton shirt, dark trousers, the kind of clothes a working man wears. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on the edge of the desk without being asked, and he sat in the only other chair in the room, and he looked at Vance for a moment. Then he said, "You're a good director, Harold." Not performed. Not conciliatory. He said it the way he had said, "You're blocking the light," as a statement of fact. Vance said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You're a difficult man to work with." Wayne said, "I know." There was a pause. The bourbon sat between them, and the coffee, and the shot list neither of them was looking at. Wayne said, 31 pictures is a real number. You know how to move a crew. You know how to protect a schedule. Those things matter. Vance said, "But," Wayne said, "but the light doesn't care about the schedule." Vance looked at him. Wayne said, "Every decision on a set is either in service of what the camera sees or it isn't. The camera doesn't care who made the decision. It only cares whether the decision is right." He took a sip of coffee. "I'm not trying to run your set, Harold. I'm trying to make sure what goes through that lens is worth watching." Vance said, "You could have told me. The first day. The column, the dialogue, the light." Wayne said, "I tried. That landed. It landed not from pain, from realization. Because Harold Vance was an honest man underneath the reputation and the authority and the 14 years of being the last word on everything. And he sat there with his bourbon and his shot list, and he ran back through the first day, and the second day, and the beginning of that Tuesday morning. And he realized that the man sitting across from him had tried. 3 times in 2 weeks in the quietest possible way, before the geometry had become unmissable. Vance picked up his bourbon glass. He looked at it for a moment. Then he raised it. Not a toast. Just a gesture. The kind of gesture that means, I understand what happened here, and I am not too old to learn from it. Wayne nodded once. He stood up, picked up his coffee cup, and walked to the door. Then he stopped, hand on the frame, and said the line that Dorothy Sells would repeat in an interview 41 years later, in 1993, from memory, word for word. The camera always tells the truth, Harold. The only question is whether you're helping it or getting in its way. He left. The door closed. Harold Vance sat alone in his production office for a long time after that. He did not pick up the bourbon again. He picked up the shot list. And he changed 8 setups. Years later, 16 years later, to be exact, in the spring of 1968, a young director named Marcus Webb was in pre-production on his first major studio picture. He was 29 years old, terrified in the specific way that only first-time directors are terrified, and he had been assigned, by the grace of some studio executive he had never met, a veteran production designer named Harold Vance. Vance was 62 by then. He had not directed another picture after Drums Along the Yucca. Not because he had been fired, he hadn't, but because something had shifted in him on that Thursday evening in 1952, and what had shifted was not a weakness but a clarification. He understood in his 62nd year that his gift was not vision. His gift was execution. He was better at getting a director's vision onto the screen than he was at generating that vision himself. It had taken him 16 years and a forward sentence to understand the difference. He became, in those 16 years, the finest production designer in Hollywood. 14 pictures. 4 Academy Award nominations. 1 win in 1961 for a cavalry picture. The irony was not lost on him. His young directors, in interview after interview across those 16 years, said the same thing about working with Harold Vance. He was meticulous. He was decisive. He was above all things honest about the light. He had a habit, they said, of stopping in the middle of a shot setup and walking to wherever the primary light source was and standing there, looking at it, and then walking carefully out of its path before he spoke another word. Marcus Webb asked him about it once, on their 3rd week of shooting, when he had watched Vance do this 3 times in a single morning. Vance said, "John Wayne taught me that." Webb said, "What did he teach you?" Vance said, "To get out of the light's way." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. On stage 14, on that Tuesday morning in August of 1952, the question in the room had been visible before a word was spoken. It was visible in the way Harold Vance held his body across from 200 witnesses. It was visible in the 4 feet of distance between Wayne's boots and the blocking tape. It was visible in the window behind them both, pouring honest light into a room full of people who were about to learn something they would spend years trying to put into words. The camera always tells the truth. John Wayne didn't say it to be clever. He said it because it was the most important sentence he knew, and Harold Vance needed to hear it, and 200 people needed to watch what happened when someone did. 1 man, 1 window, 1 lesson that Hollywood almost forgot. The light was always there. The question was only ever about who was standing in it and whether they had the honesty to step aside. And that image, that Tuesday morning, that forward sentence, is the answer to the question that opened this story. What ended Harold Vance's career as a director was not a public humiliation. It was a private education that arrived in front of 200 witnesses and left through a door in a production office at 6:15 on a Thursday evening. But here's the question nobody has asked about that Thursday evening, about what Harold Vance wrote in the margin of that shot list before he went home. That's a story for another time.